Welcome to today's podcast to take a closer look at the Barbados budget and outlook for 2017. To take a closer look at the budget presentation, we have joining with us in the virtual studio today, top Caribbean economist Marla Dugrin from the Royal Bank of Canada. Marla, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Marla, to start off today, could you give us a brief overview of some of the key themes that stood out in the Barbados budget presentation?
Okay, sure. The first thing I wanted to say was that, it was really impressive to hear the minister outline some of his concerns, his principal concerns and policy priorities, especially at this approaching 50 years of independence, for which I congratulate him and the whole country of Barbados. And, I couldn't agree with him more when he outlined his principal concerns, the 4 points being, high debt levels, large fiscal deficit, growth being an issue that, being constrained by the fiscal deterioration, and also those three issues combined impacting social development. And I agree with him completely on those. And his policy priorities coming out of that would be with respect to foreign exchange reserves and maintaining foreign exchange reserves, generating growth, reducing the fiscal deficit, and stabilizing the debt trajectory. And I'm quite happy to see that kind of priority put into perspective. Further to that, with respect to these specific policy measures, I won't go through all the policy measures that he outlined. There were quite a few, but the ones that stood out to me the most the ones I will discuss now. The first one being the actual size of the deficit I want to talk about. He did speak about reducing the deficit to 4.8% of GDP on an accrual basis, 5.8% on a cash basis, down from the current projection of 7.9% of GDP. Now, I'm not quite sure I understand what he means when he says 5% on a cash basis down from current projection of 7.9. I'm assuming that what he means is that as is, with no additional measures, you're looking at a deficit of 7.9% of GDP. But with the measures that he announced, he's looking at a deficit of 5.8% of GDP. Now, that is versus roughly 7% of GDP deficit that he achieved in the previous fiscal year just ended. So it means that we're looking at a slightly smaller deficit than what we achieved in the previous fiscal year, but you're planning for a larger fiscal deficit this year than you had planned for in the previous fiscal year, because they had planned for a 4% of GDP deficit in the previous fiscal year. So it means that we have some planned fiscal slippage here. So that's the first thing I want to outline in terms of what he discussed. The second thing that struck me was the establishment of a committee to research and possibly implement these duty-free zones throughout the country. A few zones were identified. Now, the minister said his objectives here were to encourage more shopping domestically, so less travel for shopping abroad, and encourage more inflows of US dollars. I have a bit of concern that this is going to generate more foreign exchange inflows, because all of the goods that are, or almost all of the goods that would be sold on a duty-free basis in Barbados to foreigners and locals would be imported anyway. Most of them would be imported anyway. So I'm not sure that this generates new foreign exchange. In other words, these are not domestically produced goods that you're quote unquote exporting. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, why would you earmark certain zones where you can shop on a duty-free basis, but only in hard currency? It means that you're in effect dollarizing certain zones in your country, and I'm not sure I understand how that's going to work. So for example, if you have a retailer that has a retail operation in a duty-free zone and one that's not in a zone that's not duty-free, then how does that affect his operation in the non-duty-free zone? Also, when he imports items, presumably he sells the similar items in both zones. How do you know which ones go to the duty-free zone versus the other? I mean, there are lots of issues that came up in my mind with regard to this, and I actually think if you're looking to conserve the outflow of foreign exchange and encourage the inflow of foreign exchange, there's possibly some easier ways that you can do this rather than this method, which seems to me a little bit complicated. But again, it has to be researched. It's probably not going to be implemented in the way that we're thinking. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this develops. I actually think it might be easier to just completely dollarize or devalue the currency to discourage further outflows of US dollars, but that's not necessarily a policy option that the Barbados authorities are prepared to entertain. So we'll see how that goes. There was a tax amnesty mentioned, and I just wanted to say that I think they might be successful in generating some additional revenue from that. However, you can have an issue of moral hazard developing where taxpayers might want to wait for a tax amnesty rather than pay their taxes on time. So that's just the one concern I have with that. And then also, I wanted to commend the finance minister on all of the expenditure cut measures that he articulated around the health sector costs and also around transfers to ministries and to state-owned enterprises. But I also wanted to talk a bit about the fact that he mentioned possible refinancing of contingent liabilities. It seems to me that there might be a suggestion here that maybe they're looking at a liability management solution, and I think that's a positive thing. So I think maybe with respect to contingent liabilities, there could be a debt restructure, and I think that ought to be a positive thing, especially if there are reforms to contain further debt with respect to contingent liabilities increasing again in the future. And those are the major things that stood out in my mind.
Okay, I'd like to get back to the first point you just made, that last year the government had planned for a deficit of 4% of GDP, which depended on the divestment of the terminal, and the minister did outline why that target was missed. What's to say that they will be able to execute to the target this year? Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, he did go through a lot of detail as to why that target was missed, and I thought that was quite commendable that he did that. Not many ministers of finance will own up to how they managed to miss their target. So I thought that was a pretty mature stance that he took. But I was a little bit concerned when we see the extent to which the deficit was missed by. I mean, you're planning for 4%, you end up at close to 7%. And this is in a scenario where you already have debt to GDP, as he outlined, of 138%. You have growth below 1%. Now he's planning for 5.8% versus 4% last year of GDP. So if he planned for 4 last fiscal year, he got to 7. He's now planning for 5.8. If there is some slippage, then it could mean that you can end up with a bigger deficit this year, this coming fiscal year, versus the last one. So I'm hopeful and confident that they will do their best to execute on all of the measures that they outlined. I'm just suggesting that this is a pretty wide deficit to start with at 5.8% of GDP, especially given the current existing scenario. And so to start at a 5.8% of GDP doesn't leave you much room for slippage of error there. So let's hope that they can pull this one off. But there is some doubt that it will actually be pulled off, at 5.8. But let's see.
The projections for GDP itself, the budget projects growth to reach 2.5% by the end of 2017. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, we saw the central bank actually revise their growth projection as well. We had 0.8 or 0.9 last year. And this is with, as you would remember, Melissa, this is with tourism, stopover arrivals reaching, almost 15% year on year, which is really, really remarkable growth in the tourism sector. And you recorded growth of less than 1%. So it makes me wonder, when you hear a figure 2.5% growth by the end of 2017, it makes you wonder, what is it going to take to get you to 2.5? And I think that 2.5 is a bit ambitious. So you have growth that hasn't crossed 1% since 2007, and it hasn't crossed 2% in over a decade. So I kind of have some doubt around getting to 2.5% growth by the end of 2017, especially with the amount of adjustments that are being made that was outlined in the budget. For example, higher taxes and so on. The tax, for example, on 2% on imports that will then be earmarked for the health sector costs. I'm doubtful that we can get to 2.5%, to be quite honest with you.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that measure, the new 2% tax under the National Social Responsibility Levy that would take effect on September 1st? Could you comment about what would be the impacts of that measure?
Yes, I thought that was very interesting that, the minister quite rightly said that, it's important to, from a policy perspective, to maintain universal healthcare, but the cost is really unsustainable, and it's a cost borne strictly by the central government. So the move to transfer some of that cost to the private sector, to the private citizen, I think is a positive move. So what he wants to do is twofold. One, there is a proposal that you're going to have a health insurance program that's going to be contributed to by employers and employees, which I think is commendable, and it's a positive step. However, we know that there will be impacts on people's livelihood and ability to spend, and spending power, on income, disposable income, and so on, as a result of that. But then he also articulated this National Social Responsibility Levy at 2% of the customs value of all imports, and he outlined some exemptions there. But I thought that was an interesting way of financing healthcare costs. And he said that these funds will be sort of sequestered and earmarked specifically for health sector costs. The thing is, that is a cost that's going to be applied across the board. It will affect everybody, across the board, because everybody consumes, and everybody consumes what's imported. And so everybody is going to see their cost of living go up. It means inflation is likely going to go up. And it means that because everybody is affected by a higher cost of living, the poorer people are going to be hit disproportionately versus those who are more affluent, because I think it's a regressive tax, quite frankly, that is being applied on all goods and services, and if it's applied on all goods and services, then it will affect the poor disproportionately. So there is a bit of a mismatch there in my mind, although he did say that $2 million more will be allocated to the welfare department to help in those who come forward for increased public assistance as a result of the impact of this measure. But that's for people who fall within the social safety welfare network. What about those who are employed and have jobs and will just see their spending power decline? I think maybe we could have come up with a more specific measure of addressing healthcare costs. The other impact that I think that would have is, and which might be sort of a positive unintended consequence is that if you increase the cost of imports, by extension, particularly discretionary imports, will tend to see, once there is a high enough elasticity of demand, you will tend to see the demand for those goods probably decline. So it might cause a bit of a decline in the outflow of US dollars, which the government is trying to engineer anyway. So this is one of the positive impacts that I think this can have. It can cause a slower outflow of US dollars by a higher cost of imports.
Okay, let's turn our focus a little bit and get into some of the larger line items from the budget. The minister talked about reducing transfers to state entities and possibly refinancing of contingent liabilities, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. What are your thoughts on how he's going to address the largest line item in the government's budget, which is transfers and subsidies?
Well, actually, he outlined quite a few measures that will help to address that largest line item. One I just mentioned with respect to the healthcare costs, but he also outlined some cuts basically to all of the ministries and to expenditure, discretionary expenditure, 25 million in expenditure cuts. So I was quite pleased to see him outline. There's a series of cuts here. I won't go through it in detail, but a series of cuts, 50 million each year that will be trimmed from transfers. And in addition to that, he's also outlined the fact that they're going to probably look at restructuring the contingent liabilities. And alongside that restructure, he said that there will be some reforms implemented to ensure, and I'm assuming he means reforms with respect to the state enterprises themselves and the fact that their losses end up affecting the central government's expenditure. So I'm assuming these reforms will try to ensure that the state enterprises themselves become independently economically viable and do not become a strain or an additional strain on the central government. So I was quite pleased to see him outline some measures to address transfers and subsidies. Again, as we discussed a little bit earlier, it all depends on the execution. I'm hopeful that they will push and execute these cuts, but it remains to be seen exactly how comprehensive the implementation will be.
Okay, so let's take a look at the second largest line item, which is wages and salaries. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yes, the percentage of GDP that is spent on wages and salaries is actually the highest in Barbados compared to the rest of the Caribbean. And in 2013, they actually had the highest, that's where the wage bill peaked. Since then, when they basically laid off some public sector workers and so on, the wage bill has fallen to now just under 9% of GDP from a high of about 10.3% of GDP in 2013. But what I want to add is that even though we've seen some retrenchment and we've seen wages and salaries come down, incidentally, the minister as well as the governor of the central bank would have spoken about unemployment. And we saw that, unemployment had gone up. And it had gone up to, close to 13%. But as of 12 months, an average 12 months ending March 2016 was down to 10.7%. Now, at first when I saw that, I thought, does that mean that the private sector is hiring more? When you dig behind and you look at these statistics, I'm saying that it's probably not the case because the male labor force participation rate actually went down from a peak of 73% in the third quarter of 2013 to 68.5% in the third quarter of 2015. But the female labor force participation rate has remained stable at around maybe 62% 62% over that same period. Now, the female unemployment rate is 9.7%, which is much lower than the average, while the male unemployment rate was 12.8%, which is higher than average. So, and the situation is actually usually the reverse. So I think this points to probably some structural shifts in the labor force, probably looking at maybe the slowdown in construction activity being a reason, population aging probably being a reason, the gender wage gap probably being another reason, as well as educational attainment, because we know that females actually have a higher enrollment rate and so on in tertiary education. So there seems to be a shift of, in the labor force taking place there. But I wanted to add, if I may quickly, that despite the layoffs and the retrenchments and the decline in public sector wage bill, the central bank governor has outlined repeatedly that we have not really seen this translate into improved productivity and hence improved competitiveness. So I think whatever adjustment was done to the wage bill, I think the impact on the labor force and the labor market has not been meaningful enough to cause productivity to increase relative to the unit labor costs. And I think we need to figure out whether it is that the policy needed to be implemented more strongly, or whether it is needed to change the policy in order to bring about an improvement in competitiveness. So we need to think about how we address that problem.
The other line item I'd like you to comment on is debt servicing costs. Could you give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, debt servicing actually costs about 26% right now of total total revenue. That's pretty high, and it means that it gives the government very little wiggle room. So the two issues that will most affect this is basically the extent of the deficit, which we just discussed being, I think, a little bit higher than it should be, but also how you're financing the deficit. How the debt is being raised increasingly domestically as opposed to externally. There is also the issue of higher interest rates because of declining sovereign credit ratings. I think one of the best ways to address the cost of debt servicing, of course, is, as we mentioned earlier, to have a domestic debt restructure. And I think the government seems to be looking in that direction, as indicated by the announcement that they might look to address contingent liabilities. But this still is a growing cost. If you look at how costs have moved, the interest costs and debt servicing costs, while wages and salaries have gone down, and we know transfers and subsidies are going to go down, interest costs have just kept increasing. And that has come at the expense of capital expenditures, where we're seeing capital expenditure decreasing steadily over time.
Let's talk about foreign direct investment. Why is foreign direct investment slow? What could be constraining investment in Barbados?
Well, as I just mentioned, we know we're in also alongside the fact that the government's capital expenditure budget has been squeezed as a result of increasing debt servicing costs and goods and services spending as well. I think FDI, we saw FDI come down, according to UN ECLAC data, from 791 million in 2014 to 335 million in 2015, and that's net FDI inflows. And I think one of the things that's constraining FDI, in addition to the broader issues of macroeconomic performance, confidence, and so on, I think this whole issue about the foreign exchange situation, the reserve situation, and the confidence in the currency are the major issues impacting FDI inflows, because FDI will be reluctant to find its way to your destination if they're not confident in being able to repatriate profits when they are due. So I think maybe the government could probably look at addressing the capital controls as they affect FDI if they want to attract more FDI.
Looking at the total debt, the minister spoke about that so many countries are still struggling to shake off the impacts of the global financial crisis. Do you think that this is the case for Barbados, or is there something else at play?
Well, I think this impact of the global financial crisis has morphed into so many things, and now it's Brexit and so on. There's always some issue affecting confidence globally. And that, as I mentioned earlier, will also affect FDI. But I think it's probably a little bit naive or unfair to suggest that Barbados's economic situation challenges has its genesis in the global financial crisis. Because actually, if you look at the pre-crisis fiscal deficits and debt trajectory, you can actually see that before 2009, the average year-on-year increase in debt was actually 9% per annum in the 6 years prior to 2009. But after 2009, the average year-on-year increase in debt was 5%. So it means that we were accumulating debt at a faster pace before the crisis than we were afterwards. Also, total public sector debt went from 2.92 billion in 2000 to 5.84 billion in 2008, which is basically doubling in 8 years. And this is before the crisis. So to suggest that this is the problem, the cause of the problem we're facing now is, I think, a bit unfair. I think what really was the problem was that we want to have a social spending pattern and basically a fiscal spending pattern that was not sustainable before the crisis, and then the crisis made it even worse. And so it made things worse, but it was not the cause, is what I want to suggest.
Okay, one of the concerns, the IMF said that large cash requirements of the government are a challenge increasingly met by the central bank. Could you give us some of your thoughts on what the IMF said?
Yes. So basically, the IMF, as well as the rating agencies, and even you've seen other commentators express concern about this. The monetary base, basically, meaning this is based on central bank online data. The monetary base has expanded by double digits, actually 29% on average year over year for every month since September 2014. This is a rapid expansion in the monetary base. So you're seeing the monetary base having gone from about 1.2 billion somewhere in the middle of 2014 to about 2 billion in the middle of 2016. That's a significant increase, and that's as a result of the mechanism that the central bank is using to finance deficit. Now, I just want to quote here something that the central bank announced in its most recent quarterly report. It says government requirement for domestic financing was 273 million. The national insurance scheme and the non-commercial bank private sector provided 92 million, leaving 180 million shortfall. What the central bank went on to say was that the commercial banks basically put out 198 million, and the central bank provided the rest. Now, this 198 million came from commercial banks' excess reserves deposited with the central bank. So it's a bit of I suppose, a shortcut to actually printing money, but it's using liquidity that the commercial banks have parked with the central bank and extending that liquidity to the government. And then the central bank also extends some of its own liquidity. Now, let me just tell you some data here on how the central bank has been financing government. So the central bank claims on central government increased from 59%. This is so total central bank claims on central government. 59% year-on-year increase in June of this year to 1.65 billion Barbados dollars, or a total of 61% of total central bank assets in June of this year, up from 49% June of last year. So it means that the central bank is increasingly financing the government. And it's interesting that the central bank would see this as an appropriate policy, given that this directly affects the level of reserves, because the more domestic liquidity in circulation, the more this liquidity is looking for a place to go, either via spending or via investment, and this actually puts pressure on foreign reserves, because all of this spending and investment and so on wants to take place in US dollars. So it's putting, the way that the central bank is financing the deficit is directly putting pressure on reserves.
And that's actually the next point that I wanted to get into, because in terms of priority, the minister stated, you absolutely cannot manage a small open economy like ours if you do not have reserves. So that any threats or obstacles to achieving that singular national objective, and he's referring here to maintenance of the peg to the US dollar, must be immediately and, if necessary, continuously addressed until it is no longer a challenge.
Yeah.
They're planning a deficit of 5.8% of GDP. That's 1.8 points higher than they planned for last year. How does this budget stack up in helping Barbados maintain this all-important goal of maintaining its currency peg?
Yeah, that's I suppose the million-dollar question, Melissa, because even the IMF reported back in February 2014, the last staff report that was published on Barbados said monetary policy has not been consistent with the fixed exchange rate framework. Monetization of the deficit has created uncertainty and confusion about the primary objective of monetary policy. So we know that monetary policy, as I also outlined before, is inconsistent with maintenance of the peg. And then to your point, fiscal policy is also not aligned to the maintenance of the peg. And the fiscal policy being so expansionary and with the deficit so large is actually what's driving the monetary policy stance. So I find it very curious that the minister would stress the importance in his speech, repeatedly stress the importance of this currency peg. He even went and spoke about the way that reserves are measured, and there were some who were suggesting that special drawing rights were not supposed to be used in the measurement of reserves and so on. He stressed this importance of currency peg. He stressed the adequacy of reserves, yet still the government is planning for a deficit of 5.8% of GDP, yet still the central bank is basically increasingly expanding the monetary base and increasingly purchasing government securities. And all of those activities together are in direct threat to the currency peg. So I find that a very ironic situation.
The minister spoke about reserves having declined but remaining adequate. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, reserves have been declining. He did acknowledge that. The central bank, their data is showing that reserves fell 7% year over year in June to 450 million, which they're looking at just over 13 weeks of imports. So there's a benchmark of 12 weeks, as we know, 3 months of imports. They're saying that reserves are 13 weeks of imports, but that's based on where the current cost, monthly cost or weekly cost of imports stand. And that's affected by oil prices, that's affected by aggregate demand, the amount of consumption that's taking place. And so that import cover ratio is determined by the central bank. if you look at just strictly the absolute level of reserves, 450 million is actually quite low. It's the lowest since November 2013. And so that's of concern to me, because back in November 2013, when it was as low as it is now, import cover actually fell below 12 weeks. So that's one indication to me that the level we're at now is probably borderline with the benchmark that we're trying to maintain. But also there is another benchmark that we can look at, which is making sure that you hold 100% of short-term external obligations. Now, the information I have is that in 2016, we're looking at about 110 million US dollars in debt servicing costs. And in 2017, about 125 million US in debt servicing costs. So we do have coverage, adequate coverage with respect to debt servicing costs. But with respect to import coverage, I would suggest that we're borderline, but we're adequate in an increasingly worsening position, it seems. And that's something that the minister did acknowledge.
The last thing I'd like to have you discuss with us today is, could you just give us some basic outlook scenarios for 2017?
Yeah, sure. Like I said, I think there are so many positive policies outlined in the budget with respect to especially bringing down expenditure. So assuming that those policies and those initiatives are implemented, assuming that all the FDI that he outlined with respect to Sam Lord's Castle and Hyatt and Four Seasons and so on, and multilateral lending agency support, assuming all of those bear fruit and are actually fully executed and implemented, I think we can have a situation where growth is stronger this year than it was last year. I'm not so sure I'm happy about that 2.5% growth projection by the end of next year, but I think once everything goes as planned, we can see growth increase, and maybe the government can hold out and continue on this current path, at least until the next election. However, given that reserves are, as I mentioned earlier, falling and sort of borderline, given that debt is at 138% of GDP, as the minister outlined, given that the deficit, we're planning for a wider deficit this year than we had planned for last year, it means we're pretty much on shaky ground and we're a bit vulnerable right now. And if there is any external shock, like let's just say Brexit does in fact go ahead, and there are some repercussions from that, or if oil prices recover, or if there is a weather-related crisis, a hurricane, for example, I think the level of vulnerability I'm seeing right now suggests to me that we can see things deteriorate quickly. But barring any unanticipated or unexpected external shocks, I think once everything is implemented as planned, we can continue to see some growth this year and into next year. Again, once everything that the minister has outlined is implemented as planned.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Marla, and for your thoughts and your insights. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thanks, Melissa. It always is a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
I'd just like to thank everyone that listened in today as well. So thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Bye.